Welcome back to the SDGs Podcast by Uniplat. In this episode, we'll talk about SDG 11, which is Sustainable Cities and Communities, with a distinguished guest, Mr. Nigel Clarke. He has a wealth of experience and expertise as the chair of the Standards and Regulation Board of the RICS, a globally recognized professional body for surveyors. With his extensive background in regulatory oversight and professional leadership across various sectors, we will explore the challenges and opportunities in building sustainable and inclusive urban environments. Now let's invite Mr. Clarke and listen to his thoughts on creating resilient cities and fostering community development in alignment with the SDGs agenda. Hi, Mr. Nigel Clarke. Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Thank you for making your time to coming to this interview today.
But thank you for asking me.
Okay. Well, I did a brief explanation about you and your background earlier in the opening, but can you please introduce yourself in a more, in a more detailed experience and background?
Thank you. I'm probably relevant now is that I have a career as a regulator of various healthcare professions previously, but I'm now the chair of the Standards and Regulation Board of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, which is a global body with 130,000 members, which is concerned with the profession of surveying. And we have at RICS a very particular interest in things like sustainable development goals, particularly in carbon zero, and how practically the construction industry, for example, gets to carbon zero from where it is now. And that is done through professional standards, and the Standards and Regulation Board is there to set and preserve the standards that chartered surveyors operate under, those who are members of the RICS, as we call it. But as we'll probably discuss, this is a global activity, and it requires many partnerships with many different kinds of organizations in order to try and achieve global standards.
Oh, okay. So, as the chair of the Standards and Regulation Board of the RICS, how do you envision the role of surveyors itself in promoting sustainable cities and communities under SDG 11?
Okay, I think there are, of course, many standards that apply to the way in which surveyors operate, because there are many, many different kinds of professional activity which surveyors engage in. But I'd like to concentrate really on three in the first instance, possibly four, because they are highly relevant to what is happening now, and to the whole issue of climate change and how we respond to it, and particularly how we all move towards sustainable cities in every concept of those words. Can I start with the whole life carbon assessment standard, which has just been produced in its second edition by the RICS. This is essentially aiming at exactly at what SDG 11 aims at: sustainable, inclusive, safe, resilient building activity. It starts from the premise that the construction sector is responsible for 40% of carbon emissions globally, and so it's a big target. This is an RICS approved technical sector methodology, and it's looking to assess the carbon impact from buildings and related infrastructure assets throughout their life cycle. So that means that effectively there are 7 modules to the standard. There's pre-construction work, planning in other words. There's the product stage, what are you making the buildings from? What are you making the infrastructure from? Construction stage, how do you go about building it? The use stage, a large amount of carbon production is actually during the use of a building, use of infrastructure. Deconstruction, so this is part and heading towards what one might describe as the circular economy. When you demolish a building to replace it, how much of the existing building you demolish can you reuse, and in what shape or form? And then something which we describe as beyond the asset. In other words, what do you do with the site afterwards? And there is always a final report. So you can actually learn from the experience of a particular site or building or piece of infrastructure that you have built. So there, in other words, the whole life of that particular construction asset, from the moment you start thinking about it until the moment you no longer think about it and it's been replaced by something else. And that's absolutely essential. The second edition was published last year and is now very much part of conversations that the RICS is having across the world with different organizations, whether they be governments, industry, civil society as a whole, city authorities, and not least transportation authorities. We'll come back to that in a moment as well. There's a piece too about resource management. There's a standard that applies to improving efficiency and reducing waste. That's extremely important. We produce a lot of carbon that we simply do not need to produce. And by eliminating waste, you reduce that production of carbon. So that's about people, it's about natural resources, it's about energy.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that is now about using data better. If you looked at the NEOM project in Saudi Arabia, it's a superb use of intelligent data use. So in a sense, the way in which you run your city, you constantly have data feeding back about how you use energy, how you don't, so that you can manage the buildings, manage the transportation assets and so forth more efficiently all the time, because you're learning as you go along. And that was not possible 20 years ago. Now you can, and so it's fed into the kind of standards which you expect surveyors to be considering when they are designing buildings, when they're designing transportation, when designing infrastructure, but also working with others on actually the facilities management side of the whole piece. So that is an essential part of that. We probably ought to mention retrofit standards too. We referred earlier to in whole life carbon assessment to actually demolishing buildings, but frequently you will see buildings retrofitted to take account of new building techniques, new technology, improved, well, in some countries, better ways of circulating air, so you don't need to use air conditioning to quite the same extent. Different ways of powering air conditioning too, of course, more increased use of solar power and so forth, but also heating and making sure your insulation in buildings is a lot of. So you've seen a dramatic improvement in materials, and one of the things that clearly we expect surveyors to do is to maintain their knowledge of building materials, building techniques, which can then be part of the whole sustainability agenda as well. So those are the kind of three immediate things that I think we should be paying particular attention to at the moment. There are a lot of other standards, but those I think go most directly and are moving fastest in terms of the sustainability agenda.
Okay, thank you very much for the very comprehensive answers. So, well, I think it also answers to the next question, which is, you mentioned about technologies that can make new standards for making more sustainable environments, right? So maybe you can elaborate more on how do you see the integration of technologies impacting the work of surveyors in creating more sustainable built environments?
I'm tempted to say it's hard to know where to start because it's so great. Perhaps we take a step back and say, if we look at what we mean by sustainable, one of the things that I think is different now than would have been the case in the past is that in the past you would have had city designers and city planners imposing solutions on the population. We all know, for example, and well, it's a good example actually, there is now a lot of good data that tells you that the quality of the built environment has a big impact on human health. And we are beginning to understand more what a well-designed, healthy building looks like, feels like, is, as it were. We're at the beginning of that. But in order to properly understand how buildings should be constructed, what they should be made from, or what they should not be made from. After when I was young, asbestos was in many buildings around the world. I think you'll find that there are a lot less now, and nobody would put a building up with asbestos in it anymore. But we're learning as we go along. But understanding how you deal with that needs feedback technology all the time. You need to be measuring things. We are much better at measuring a wide variety of variables that allow people to understand better how design may change, how materials use may change, what different new materials may be available. There are a lot of construction materials used now which were not available 50 years ago.
Right.
And they will all make a difference. But I'd go further than that. There's something about designing for humans that is a very key part of this. And in many respects, we're behavioral science. In other words, how do people behave, and how would you expect them to behave, and how do you plan according to the way they behave, and not plan because you want them to behave in a particular way when they don't. That is actually becoming more and more important. So if you look at transportation in big cities, so we must face the fact that when we talk about sustainable cities now, we are talking about much bigger urban environments than we used to. Now it is not unusual for cities to have a population of more than 10 million people. That was extremely unusual. 30 years ago, there would have been no more than 3, I think, if I've got that right.
Yep.
Either way, the point is the same. So you need to know things like, if you're an old city and you have bus routes which are the same as they were 100 years ago, unless you have proper data that says actually these bus routes do not follow the journeys that people now want to take. They live in different places, they work in different places, they entertain themselves in different places. You need to be able to change that and not just stick to where you were. And there is now modern technology in transportation too, which will transform the way in which you can retrofit city transportation in. But that means that you need to think about how you use cars in cities. Then that leads you to the next question, which is, if you've got fewer cars in cities, you clearly need fewer parking lots.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're releasing space from parking lots, what are you doing with that space? And suddenly you've got options coming into how a city develops. But there are some things, for example, like working from home technology, which are also going to pay an impact here. And we don't know yet quite how that will work. I think myself that because of the impact of the pandemic, nobody could move for various tough periods, so you did stay at home. A lot of how people behave in communal spaces fell away for a bit, and now is coming back. What do people do in those communal spaces? Do you need more of them? What facilities do you need in them? Do you need to make greater provision in a different kind of way for food supply? What proportion of those are leisure facilities rather than working facilities? Are we going to need slightly less office space because people may be working from home 20% of the time? We don't know that. And actually all we can do is measure all the time and try and work it out. But knowing about that kind of element, those elements of human behavior, is absolutely critical if you are going to have a sustainable city which you build and redevelop in the right kind of way, without finding yourself with housing developments which are soulless, where people don't want to live. So if they can avoid it, they will. There's some very interesting additional things. RICS ran a competition last year looking at sustainable development ideas, and it was won by a chartered surveyor from the Philippines who had developed an idea of using bamboo to build housing developments, for example, for construction workers working on sites,
Okay.
who would likely not to be able to afford decent housing, but actually this was a way of making sure they did have decent housing relatively inexpensively and in a sustainable manner. And that kind of idea is, we would put that into guidance rather than a standard, because there are lots of ways of solving these kinds of problems. But if you can make sure that you publicize good practice, other people will have better ideas, they'll build on the ideas that people have had, and we will begin to start finding new solutions to old problems. I think it's the easiest way to describe it. I think some quite interesting things. If you get huge numbers of people in a city, you make big demands on utilities. We may need to think more clearly too about how we design facilities in relation to the provision of clean water, the removal of sewage, the provision of energy. But the question of the provision of energy on its own, you know that technology over the next 10 to 15 years will transform much of that. We will see constantly improving surfaces on solar power units, which will become much more efficient in terms of converting solar energy into electricity effectively. So all of those pieces, but the issue of waste more broadly too, how does a large agglomeration deal with recycling and with the removal of say, vegetable waste, all of which actually they may provide better